So this was, let me see if I can do this. It's like singing the 12 Days of Christmas. There's 3 petticoats, 1 modesty petticoat, the bustle, the drawers, the chemise, the stockings. What have I forgotten?
The corset and the boots.
The corset. Well, we haven't talked about the boots yet, but the corset. I did forget the corset. I probably wouldn't have worn a corset back then. Welcome to Land of Laura, the irreverent yet scholarly podcast about all things Laura Ingalls Wilder. Friends, I have invited someone back into the studio for purely selfish reasons. Back on episode 4, Laura Keyes talked about the dresses in the Little House series, but we never got to talk about Maz Delaine. So I asked her to come back so we could talk about Maz Delaine, and because we needed something else to talk about, we had a conversation about underwear. Let's get to it. Everyone out there in the land of Laura, Laura Keyes is back. And she is back to tell us about, a lot of things. But the first thing that she's going to tell us about is, as promised, Maz Delaine. Thank you for coming back, Laura.
You are so welcome. The last time we talked, oh my gosh, we covered so much stuff about fashion in the Little House books. And I'm so glad that we're able to come back here and talk just about Maz Delaine.
And everyone loved the last episode. I will tell you a secret. On some platforms, it is the most popular episode. Actually, that's not true. Bill Anderson's is the most popular episode, but yours is second on some platforms.
Well, thank you so much.
Before we start, I would love to congratulate you on your Mary Todd Lincoln Award, which you won a couple months ago.
Thank you so much for that. I did win that award when I attended the Lincoln Day celebration in Hodgenville, Kentucky, the first weekend in October. And that's a wonderful weekend down there, really close to Abraham Lincoln's a birthplace. This was the second time that I've won it, and I had a lot of fun doing it.
All right. Tell me what you know about Maz Delaine. What is the history of Maz Delaine, as you can best ascertain?
Well, first let's begin with the name itself. Delaine is a French word meaning a fine woolen fabric. And Delaine is the term Mrs. Wilder uses for the dress throughout its description in Little House in the Big Woods. Although when she describes it again in On the Banks of Plum Creek, it is called a chalice, which is another term for wool cloth, but that specifically means printed wool cloth.
And how do you know for sure that that's the Delaine she's talking about in On the Banks of Plum Creek? From a total layperson, I need to know.
I am looking in the chapter called Cattle in the Hay. And if you look on page 68 of the editions that so many of us enjoy, it says Ma wore her hoop skirts and her best dress, the beautiful chalice with little strawberries on it that she had worn to the sugaring dance at Grandma's long ago in the big woods.
Oh my goodness, that just goes to show how long it's been since I read On the Banks of Plum Creek. I have to rectify that. Okay, thank you.
You are welcome. On the Banks of Plum Creek is really, it's really a full book. It's actually packed with so much more than you remember. So that is how we know that it is the same dress On the Banks of Plum Creek. Now, to the best of my knowledge, that is the last time it's mentioned in the books. Let's go back to the original description that Mrs. Wilder put in the book, Little House in the Big Woods, when talking about the Delaine. It was described as, quote, a dark green with a little pattern all over it that looked like ripe strawberries. A dressmaker had made it in the East. Laura and Mary had never seen Ma wear it, but she had shown it to them once. She had let them touch the beautiful dark red buttons that buttoned up the basque up the front, and she had shown them how neatly the whale bones were put in the seams insides with hundreds of little crisscross stitches, end quote. So there's a lot going on there. Just to clarify some other words, because a lot was in there, a basque, and that's Basque, is the part of a lady's dress which resembles a jacket with a short skirt. Does anyone here remember the 1980s? And we had little peplums that were like the jackets, or even we had like these 2-layer dresses. Does anyone else remember that? It became really big again in the 1980s to have like this 2 to 5 inches peplum, especially over your butt.
What's a
Come on,
peplum?
people.
Oh my gosh.
You can picture it.
I am
Yes.
picturing a semi-formal in high school.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Think of what was just below your waist in the 1980s. There's a couple inches of fabric, and then just slightly a couple inches hung over your skirt that you were wearing with that outfit when we were younger. Let's just say younger.
Younger skin.
So the point is that could be called a peplum. That's kind of a modern term, but the basque is the part of the lady's dress. That's the fashion popular in the 1850s, to have a little bit of that fabric extend past the waist and slightly cover the skirt. I've told you before, fashion just keeps getting recycled from decade to decade. So this style of dress with this jacket type bodice that, like I said, had a little bit of fabric hanging over the skirt, it was popular on and off from the 1850s, honestly, through the end of the century. According to Mrs. Wilder, this was the way Ma's Delaine was made. If we can assume that the fictional Ma and Pa were married in 1860, when the real Ma and Pa were married, this was a very fashionable dress in the 1850s. And as is described in Little House in the Big Woods, Ma had a dressmaker make this. She was earning enough money and was a fashionable young lady such that she paid another woman to make a garment, something that, at least as described in the Little House books, doesn't happen again. I believe it was made in either 1858 or 1859. And as I've mentioned before in one of my presentations to the LIWLRA conference, was that in 1856, the cage crinoline was actually reinvented from an Italian Renaissance design. But I say that to say I believe Ma's Delaine, made in 1858-ish, was a dress made to go over a cage crinoline. Now, for those of you who are picturing let's just say a stereotypical hoop skirt that you might see a Civil War reenacting lady wear, that's pretty much what a cage crinoline is. That's the style of dress that I'm saying Ma's Delaine was. So the description that we read from Mrs. Wilder about the sugaring off at Grandpa's, that took place in roughly 1873, if we're following kind of the same timeline. You know, the fashion of the time, the high society styles of dresses. By 1873, they hadn't really traveled from those large cities in the East to the big woods of Wisconsin. And therefore, even though the dress is approximately 14 years out of date by some standards, I believe Caroline would have still worn that dress, probably over a cage crinoline, to the sugaring off dance, for the simple reason that it was still her best dress. Again, in On the Banks of Plum Creek, after the brief description of what both Carrie and Ma wore for their first trip into town in On the Banks of Plum Creek, the story moves on. But just to remind everyone, specifically the description on page 68, once again, it describes Ma wearing her best dress. This is something that Ma, Caroline, would have worn until the dress was rags. And then she would have used the rags because, as you might have heard me say in the previous podcast, clothing and fabric as a whole, they were precious items. They were something that one had to earn money in order to purchase. And therefore, you took care of them, and they were not to be wasted. Going back to the description in Little House in the Big Woods, I know that a lot of people have asked me in the past about the phrase that Mrs. Wilder used, that the whale bones were sewn into the sides with crisscross stitches. So the term whale bones is something of a misnomer. It's true, bodices and definitely corsets, they weren't stiffened with the bones of whales. Think about how big, like a rib cage of a huge whale is. But with another part of the whale called baleen. And baleen is the feathery, comb-like feature in the mouths of whales, which screen and trap the food as they swim through the water. And if you're not sure really what this looks like, Finding Nemo is really accurate when it comes to whales. I do recommend it. So baleen is actually made of keratin, a flexible material that's kind of like fingernails. It's more like fingernails than it is bone. But in the past, the definition and of course the whale's anatomy, that was all blurred. And baleen, whalebone, they were used interchangeably. So that is the true answer when someone says, were the bones of whales in this dress? Well, not really.
But they were literally from whales.
They were from whales, but it was just another part of the whale.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know what I assumed. I mean, fashion.
This is what we learn. There's no way that a vegan dress could have been made. Let me put it that way. No way.
So you had talked before about how she made over the Delaine. Tell me about that.
So the best way I can describe that is by looking at the dress and then comparing what you have, the dress that was made, by my estimation, in about 1858, and look at what the current fashions are. This is 1875, maybe, when they come to Plum Creek. We know that they're in Walnut Grove on and off for a couple different years. Well, let's just say they're roughly 1875, 1876, something like that. Well, now it's even further. Roughly 19 years since this dress was made. And so to a skilled seamstress like Caroline, she would have tried her best to look at the garment that's in front of her and then look at some of the current fashion plates. What is difficult for us to surmise when reading either the fictional books that Mrs. Wilder wrote, or, of course, looking at what we know the Ingalls family did based on the researchers and biographers who have come after her. We just don't know how much information Caroline had. We know that the family was moving, and if they weren't moving, they had spent quite a while in Indian territory where mail was quite uncertain. Therefore, I find it unlikely that Caroline knew too much about what the current fashions were. It could have been that she wore her, it's described as hoop skirts. It could have been a cage crinoline, the kind of very round, puffy skirt that was fashionable in the 1850s that a lot of people remember about the Civil War era. And that was years and years out of date.
Well, that's interesting now to think about it, because they talk in Little Town on the Prairie about maybe hoops will come back in, and that's 1882-ish, something like that?
Yes. The term hoops was a very general term that was used for any type of metal or flexible tape garment that was worn underneath the dress to give it a specific shape. You heard me say cage crinoline before. That is a specific kind. Hoops was a slang. I don't quite want to call it slang, but I'll say it was a general term used. And by that, I mean, it could have been used, just hoops. That's just a general term, whether we mean a bustle, whether we mean a cage crinoline, or whether we mean any other kind of undergarment that is worn underneath the skirt to make it puff out in a very specific way. So the fact that Mrs. Wilder, as author, wrote the term hoop skirts actually does not tell me what kind of undergarment Caroline wore underneath her dress.
Related to hoops, do you know about the special kind of hoop skirts that Laura ended up getting in Little Town on the Prairie?
I do have an estimation on those. By the time we get to these happy golden years, they're described as being changeable, or the fact that Laura could alter the tapes. She called them tapes inside, and those would have been very strong woven fabric. If you think about kind of what your handle of a good canvas tote bag is made out of,
Okay.
that kind of thick tape would have held this together. So what I believe when talking about that bustle that young Miss Ingalls finally had in the book These Happy Golden Years was that kind of bustle that could be slightly altered to make it slightly wider and slightly narrower, which of course gave the wearer more autonomy in the look that she wanted to wear. And so that's what I believe she meant by special.
Okay. So tell me what a bustle is exactly.
Now, I do admit this is difficult to do without imagery, but the bustle is the undergarment that is made out of probably a very thick cloth. The ones that I have are made with thick cloth. Possibly this tape, which would have been like a tightly woven cotton, at least an inch, if not many inches wide, and then some flexible metal. It would be all held and stitched together in a very specific way. And the bustle kept the rest of the skirt to mainly flow and drape over the back of the body.
So it's in the back. The bustle, that's how I understand it. It's in the back, and it makes the dress really puff out in the back? Is that the point?
It does make the dress really puff out in the back. You are correct. Again, compare that to the image that you have of the cage crinoline, which is all around. You know, that's the dress that is all around the woman. It's kind of evenly distributed. The bustle,
so like you think of a bird cage, then when you say cage.
Yes, that is why it's called cage crinoline.
Got it.
And so the bustle focuses almost all the fabric to be in the back of the body. And that was the fashion at the time.
Is there any practicality to that, or is it all looks?
Oh, you're asking about practicality for women's fashion. My goodness. I would say truly very little practicality. It is mostly for fashion. The only practical way of looking at that is that the front of the body, and therefore the front of the dress, is actually very flat. And Mrs. Wilder, as author, describes some of the dresses in Little Town on the Prairie. She describes some of the women's dresses as flat in the front. And that's what she meant compared to the huge gathers of fabric in the back. They were very flat. But once again, I would like to remind the listeners that we're discussing the height of fashion. I've said numerous times that the Delaine was Ma's best dress, and now we're talking about a bustle dress that young Miss Wilder had in These Happy Golden Years and other women had in Little Town on the Prairie. These were their best dresses. They were not your everyday dresses that were worn while doing chores on the farm.
So a bustle, if one is using a bustle, if a bustle is in fashion, it's a piece of underclothes that you put on before you put your dress on.
Yes, of course. It is a piece of underclothing. I think that there are specific layers involved when it comes to underclothing.
Have you worn a bustle?
Oh, yes. I have worn a bustle. I own 2 different kinds of bustles. I do. And I've
for your historical interpretations?
Yes, and I do have the bustle and a recreation of the pink lawn dress that is described in these Happy Golden Years. It's not perfect, but I did wear that at one of the conferences that I attended to speak about Laura Ingalls Wilder's fashion. In that dress and wearing that bustle, I was able to prove that it is possible to sit on a chair and have a really adventurous tiny kitten climb up the bustle and get stuck there.
What is it like to sit?
It does need practice. It does. But remember that the pieces of what I keep calling tape and the flexible metal, and of course the fabric, these are all flexible items. And so as long as you get used to it and you know exactly where to sit down, I do not recommend sitting in a bustle in a beanbag. Not at all. Not at all. But it is completely possible to sit in a regular chair because you just get used to the new shape of your extended body. Pretty much when wearing a bustle. I have sat in plenty of chairs. I have driven my car in some cage crinolines, and I think in one bustle. I have people come up to me and ask me, oh, well, how do you breathe in that? What was most amusing is that I was sitting down fully in a cage crinoline, fully in costume, and I stood up and I greeted some people. And the first thing someone said to me was, how do you sit in that? And I wanted to say, you just saw me sit in that.
What are some things that people like me are the least likely to understand about underclothes of the era?
I think the first answer to that is how many there were.
Give me a
And
number.
how Oh, it is very difficult to put a number because it truly does depend on the woman's preference and, of course, her resources. If she was a woman with not many resources, she just wouldn't be able to have as many petticoats and such like that. Personally, I usually wear 3 layers of undergarments before I even put the dress on. And sometimes it's 4, but it's usually 3. The chemise is the first layer that is put on over the bare skin.
Is that like a slip?
Stockings, it is. The modern equivalent would be a slip. Yeah. Stockings would be next. These would be knitted, probably by a family member, if not by you. Cotton stockings in the summer for everyday wear, wool stockings for the cold, cold weather. And if one truly had the money for it, one could possibly knit themselves silk stockings. But it's uncertain if the Ingalls family would have ever had those resources.
And what would be the benefit of silk? Just it would be a lot lighter?
It's not only lighter, but it's really quite fashionable. Therefore, it's very impractical for wearing on a farm. I have worn silk stockings only to dances, historic dances that I have attended, when I am not wearing boots. I am wearing dancing shoes, and therefore you can kind of see the stockings when I'm twirling, because other than that, my feet are actually hidden underneath the skirt. But twirling is fun.
How high did the stockings go up?
Again, that was actually kind of a personal preference, at least to the bottom of the knee, but I have seen some patterns. These were expected to be made at home, if not by you, then by a family member, and some of the patterns go over the knee. And over the knee, it's easier to tie on a garter because that's how they're staying on your leg. There is no elastic. Technically, elastic existed at that time, but it was not used for stockings. It actually initially had commercial uses before it got into fashion.
So we've talked about the chemise. We have talked about stockings. What else we got?
The next step are the drawers. They could be called pantalettes, but I think that's more of a fancy and possibly more European term. And after the drawers, that's typically when a woman would put on one's corset.
Wait a minute. Tell me about the drawers. Are they what are they shaped like? Shorts?
Depending on preference, they could be pretty long, but typically I see them just past the knee length.
So like capri pants.
Yes, capri pants. Yes.
And how do they
And
stay up?
those were usually either buttons with a waistband. They could be buttoned. They could do a drawstring. Since these garments were being made either by you or a family member, one had a lot of autonomy in the decision making. I have to have a lot of different undergarments because I give historic performances so often and I have to wash these garments so often. I have some that are tied, I have some that are buttoned. It's just the preference at the time.
So is it the drawers then that would be constructed to allow for easy bathroom use?
Yes, you're absolutely right. The drawers would be constructed to allow for easy bathroom use. So drawers were not pulled down around one's ankles for bathroom use. They were not pulled down.
They just
They,
came apart.
yep, they just came apart. And so after the drawers, the corset.
It's
And
Mary's corset.
yes, Mary's corset, that scene. That the corset, once again, I will emphasize that a lot of this was the preference of the woman. We see in the books that young Laura Ingalls does not want to wear her corset and actually takes it off when she is doing heavy manual labor, which I am not surprised to hear. Many of us would not wear a fancy, perhaps teeny bit too tight, nice dinner dress when we're doing manual labor around the house and mopping the floor and taking out the trash.
Or when we're
Not,
sleeping. She didn't want to wear it when she was sleeping, too.
you are absolutely correct. I have definitely heard that some women had the opinion that the corset should be worn at all times unless you were bathing because it kept the waist small. Truly, that's not healthy. After
If
the corset, what is then put on is the modesty petticoat, and that's a pretty small petticoat, and it comes down not to the floor but just to the ankles, and that's especially helpful for the cage crinoline because the cage crinoline can fly up if one is twirling, the aforementioned twirling, which is fun, or one is perhaps just briskly walking and there is a gust of wind. The modesty petticoat still keeps the world from seeing your ankles, and therefore it is for modesty.
so, the petticoat is a skirt.
Yes. And again, it's not a large skirt that would go over the bustle or cage crinoline. It goes kind of flat against the body,
Got it.
against the legs, really. Now, I know some of you are trying to remember the example that is given in Little Town on the Prairie with young Miss Ingalls frustrated with the prairie winds that were swirling her bustle and she had to twirl in order to keep it from swirling up. I will tell you right now, I don't know exactly what she's describing. I have never experienced that. It could be because I do not normally wear the full costumes on the Great Plains with huge prairie winds. That could be it. But I'm not able to really answer what is going on there.
I'm so glad you addressed that, at least because that was one of my questions.
Yes, I apologize. I have been asked that question when I'm giving presentations about fashion, and I'm sorry to disappoint. I just don't know what's going on there.
So, in Little Town on the Prairie, it's on page 272 in the chapter School Time Begins Again. Right after Laura and Carrie share the discovery that they've never seen Ma's ears. "They're probably pretty ears, too," said Carrie. "You look like her, and your ears are little and pretty." "Well," Laura began. Then she stopped and spun round and round, for the strong wind blowing against her always made the wires of her hoop skirt creep slowly upward under her skirts until they bunched around her knees. Then she must whirl around and around until the wires shook loose and spiraled down to the bottom of her skirts where they should be. It's a big mystery.
It is. I do think that the wind plays a strong role in this. And it's very likely that I have simply not experienced this.
So it sounds like the next time you go to DeSmet, you have a job.
Oh, goodness. I will have to attempt that experiment. So we were talking about the layers of undergarments, and I mentioned the chemise, the stockings, the drawers, the corset, the modesty petticoat, and the bustle. So the bustle would go on next, and then the petticoats above the bustle. And there's a wonderful description about this in these Happy Golden Years, where Laura describes all of the layers that she needs to wear the brown poplin. And so putting on a number of petticoats after one puts on the bustle, then
How does one put on the bustle? How is the bustle fastened?
there's a variety of ways that it could be fastened. I myself own some that are fastened with large hooks and eyes, with buttons, very large buttons. Another way that I've seen them is something that looks similar to how a watch strap is put through holes and then buckled on that way. Since some of these would be made in-house by patterns, then one could choose one's own closure. But the other thing is that just like undergarments today in the 21st century, there were many different manufacturers of various bustles. Different size bustles, a lot of different closures because there were different manufacturers. And then after the bustle is fastened, that's when at least two petticoats are put on over the bustle. And it is only after that that the skirt can go on.
So this was, let me see if I can do this. It's like singing the 12 Days of Christmas. It's like there's 3 petticoats, 1 modesty petticoat, the bustle, the drawers, the chemise, the stockings. What have I forgotten?
The corset and the boots.
The corset. Well, we haven't talked about the boots yet, but the corset. I did forget the corset. I probably wouldn't have worn a corset back then.
And so after the skirt is put on, then the bodice, or what goes on the top of the body, then the bodice is put on. And as we have seen, as I've started to describe, the bodice could be just different according to the current fashions of the time, according to one's own taste, and of course, according to one's own means. We know that the Ingalls family was of limited means, definitely during certain parts of Laura's adolescence. But we also know that once Laura became a teenager, and once the family really settled in DeSmet and didn't move any further than DeSmet, that's when she started becoming interested in fashion. She wanted to keep up with fashion. And of course, we know that the fictional Miss Ingalls wanted to do that. We can only surmise that the real life Miss Ingalls felt something like that. That's when people get really creative. Because if they can't afford everything that they want, then they get creative on how they can make something nice out of not much fabric or not much money.
What are the most common questions that you get asked about clothing?
Oh, goodness. As I've hinted at before, I get asked how I can sit in clothing when an audience member sees me in complete historic costume. I get asked how I can move in the clothing. I get asked how I can breathe in the clothing. That question becomes especially annoying after I have just given an hour-long presentation in front of a crowd. And my answer has often been, did you notice me breathing within the last hour? When you see a costumed interpreter and you feel like asking them a question, ask it in your head once first and then decide if it's worth asking out loud. Other questions that I get are, how were the clothes washed? Now, we do have really good descriptions of those in the Little House books. I'm not an expert when it comes to historical washing of garments, but in general, the undergarments were washed much more often than the regular dresses, especially the very, very nice dresses. It's possible they were only spot cleaned, or they were spot cleaned until they really, really, really needed to be washed. And I'll remind people that the undergarments or the dresses were worn until it was wash day. You didn't throw them in a heap and wear something else. It could be you didn't have anything else to wear. It's very likely that there were more changes of underwear than they were of dresses. I will say that. It's very likely. But I cannot say anything for certain. And especially in Little House in the Big Woods, we saw the detailed description of washing the family's clothes. It was an all day long process. If you ran out of an undergarment, if you only had 2 work dresses and you got them both dirty in 2 days of work, you didn't have time to do a whole day's washing. You had work to do on the farm. And so you kept wearing those dresses until wash day.
How long does it take you to get dressed? And how long did it take them to get dressed back then?
I can usually get dressed relatively quickly. And by quickly, I mean about 20 minutes. That's quick for me. That is quick. I like to give myself a lot more time than that. My record was when I was so running late to a program and I just kind of didn't wear a lot of the undergarments and I was in and out of that dressing room in 7 minutes. That's a record and I don't even want to beat that. That was horribly stressful. But for the most part, I would say 20 minutes. And that's assuming that I've already dressed my hair beforehand, which is just a whole nother conversation. To answer your second question, how long did it take them? It's truly impossible for me to answer that.
I thought that as soon as I asked you.
Yes, it's true, as we've discussed today, that they had many layers. So it took time to put many layers on. However, they were used to it. They were used to the many layers, and so it would not be a laborious, unfamiliar process as many people in the 21st century. If you were given the garments and said, okay, get dressed, many people, it would take a while for them to figure out the order of things, etc.
What would they wear on regular everyday days when they were wearing a calico work dress? Would they wear everything you just described?
By that, you mean all the undergarments that I described?
Yes.
Certainly they would not wear a bustle in order to do the farm chores, but it's uncertain because it's not a good idea to start saying, oh, always and never and stuff like that. But in general, it would be unlikely that the woman would wear as many undergarments because it was a day around the house. They were not leaving the house. They were not likely to be seen by someone other than their family members. And of course, there was hard work to do, whether inside the house or outside the house. And therefore, it's likely that they would have worn fewer undergarments. I mentioned earlier that young Laura didn't like to wear her corset when she was, pretty much a teenager working hard. It's very likely that plenty of other women had the same attitude as well. If I'm just working around the yard, the house, I'm not going to wear my corset.
Well, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. This was wonderful. I learned a lot, and hopefully listeners will too.
Thanks again for inviting me, Sandra. I so appreciate that I'm able to share this information with so many Laura Ingalls Wilder fans. And I realize that some of the descriptions were kind of difficult since this is an audible medium and not a visual medium. But folks, feel free to contact me, or I'm happy to give, a program on Laura Ingalls Wilder fashion, maybe at your local library or museum.
And you can do that online as well.
Yes, I can give this online. For more information, you can just look me up at Historic Voices on Facebook and historicvoices.info.
Thank you, Laura. So if you ever need to dress for a birthday party at the depot, or you need to sit through one of Reverend Brown's long, boring sermons, you know what to put on under your dress. And if you, the listener, are one who would not have worn dresses back then, well, never forget how lucky you are. FYI, there is in fact one more mention of the Delaine dress in By the Shores of Silver Lake. Ma wears it when she's taking the girls on the train to Tracy in the chapter Riding in the Cars. But it's simply referred to as a dark Delaine dress with white lace collar and cuffs. And there's no mention of strawberries. So whether it's her Delaine from Little House in the Big Woods or simply another woolen dress, we just don't know. Land of Laura is created and executive produced by me, Sandra Hume. Special thanks to Canadian folk punk band the Dreadnaughts for our theme music, and extra special thanks to all the guests, like Laura, who give so generously of their time and knowledge. I hope to see you next time. Make sure you subscribe to Land of Laura on your favorite podcast channel so you can hear about episodes as soon as they drop. As Pa says, there's plenty more down cellar in a teacup, and as Ma might have said, it takes all kinds of people to make a Little House world.